This is part 2 of 3 videos on types of claims. As I said at the end of the part 1 video, this one we're going to work with this section of our textbook that talks about claims about truth, claims about the nature of reality. We're not talking about disputing facts here, by the way. The fact that today is Monday when I'm making this, that's not something we can argue about because that's the day that it is. It's simply something that's absolutely true. But we're arguing the larger things like what is the meaning of these things? How do they fit? What kinds of categories might we put things into so that we can understand them better? Our textbook offers 3 different claim types that fall into this category. Definition, that is, what is something? What category does it fit into? Resemblance, which are very similar. What is this thing like? Maybe an argument by analogy is what we're thinking about here. And then causal, does X cause Y? Does human activity, for instance, cause global warming? But you can actually use these claim types for some much more complicated decisions that you could make. Okay, definition. I mean, most of us would say, I look up a definition in a dictionary or I Google it, right? I mean, definition should be the easiest. I'm going to suggest to you that actually definition is the hardest, okay? And that's why we're starting with it. There's always ways to put things into competing categories, and you and your audience may differ on what categories certain things, certain activities, certain behaviors might fit into, okay? And you and the audience may very well disagree about what categories things fit into. Fundamentally, what motivates us with the idea of definition is a very, very ancient concept, the rule of justice, that things in the same category should be treated in the same way. You see a lot of pseudo arguments about this, about politicians' behavior lately. For example, well, if we treated Bill Clinton this way, how come we aren't treating Donald Trump this way? Or if we treated Mark Sanford this way, how come we're not treating Eric Greitens in this way? I mean, you have these kinds of debates all the time. So these definition arguments can really get complicated. It sounds like something really simple when we just say, oh, there's a definition, there's a category we could fit it into. But in fact, they get very complicated. One of my favorite examples is American cars. How do we define an American car? Are U.S. manufactured Toyotas, Hondas, and Kias, for example, or Mercedes or BMWs? Are those American cars in the way we tend to think of Ford and Chevrolet as American car companies? We used to think of Chrysler as an American car company, but 50% of it is owned by Fiat, an Italian multinational firm. So do we count those guys in because they have plants in America, or do they not? This gets to be really, really complicated if you think about it. We are having this debate right now as the president's proposing tariffs on Canada and Mexico, our NAFTA partners, in order to force them into offering concessions for other categories of trade where he feels that they have an advantage over us. So this definition of what's an American car is not just a marketing decision. It's actually a very complex government decision. And I would be fascinated to know what you think. 90% of the Hondas sold in the United States are built in the United States. About the same percentage of Toyotas that are sold in the United States are made in the United States. All the Kias and all the Hyundais sold in the United States, with a very few exceptions, are made in the United States. But we tend to think of these as Japanese or Korean cars, not as American, even though they're 70% or more American parts. They're built entirely by American workers at American factories located in the United States. Ford and Chevrolet and GM make a number of their cars in Canada and Mexico, as do other car manufacturers. So, but we still say, oh, those are American companies. So is it where the cars are built? Is it the ownership of the company? What exactly do we use? So the more you think about this, the more you can see how definition arguments get really, really complicated. So, well, why are we doing this? What's the point of this? We're looking for examples that prove that whatever our X is belongs in Y category. Are U.S. manufactured cars, even if they're owned by foreign companies, are they American? Foreign cars is the X, or cars manufactured by foreign companies in the United States, and American. So that's where we're trying to figure out where they fit. Another example, are smartphones addictive? And I think most of us would say, yes, absolutely, no question that they are addictive. We know what smartphones are. We can define those. Those are not flip phones, they're not simple phones, but they're complex. And are they addictive in the sense that we pull them out and use them uncontrollably? Well, I believe we do. I certainly see that among my students, and I certainly, now that I have one, finally after years of resisting it, I see myself doing the same thing. One of the other keys to a definition argument is that we agree on what things are. We know what a smartphone is. We know what the definition of smartphone is. We know what the definition of addiction is. So it's a question of fitting those into those two categories. Some of you may question whether smartphones are addictive, and I can point you to a number of studies that have been done on college students where they've been deprived of a smartphone for 1 day or up to 7 days in two different studies, and they find that students begin to exhibit the same sorts of signs, physical signs, as are associated with withdrawal from an addictive drug. Their pupils dilate, their pulse races, their blood pressure goes up. They get dry mouth. They do all the kinds of things that that people do who are addicted to drugs, who are deprived of those drugs. So we know that physiologically phones have a certain addictive quality. It has to do actually with the level of dopamine in your system and how a phone triggers that. Trust me. Our textbook puts definition arguments into two different groups. One, we have simple categorical arguments where we don't disagree about what the definition of why is. American cars would not be this one, okay? But the cell phone addiction one would fit into it. This is one where, we already agree on what why is. We know what addiction looks like. We know what addictive behavior is like. It's just a question of figuring out, do smartphones really produce an addictive kind of reaction in people? Definitional arguments, this is more like the car one, where we actually do argue over what exactly is the definition of why. Is an American car US made by a US company, by US workers in the United States, or is it something a little bit more complex than that? And so our job as writers of arguments like this is to establish boundaries for these terms. And how do we do that? Well, part of that comes from our research, and part of it comes from what kind of values, education, moral background, what kind of knowledge our audience has. This is what Toulmin calls a warrant. Okay, so when we're working with the second category of arguments, these ones where we have to decide how we define the why term, we have to develop some kind of criteria to determine the nature of the category. And then we have to imagine an example to that criteria. Here's one that's maybe the most complex example, is what exactly is a human being? And this is not a simple question. We all know what a human being looks like, right? We all kind of recognize what human beings are. The question is, are they a person or are they property? Is a human embryo, a fertilized egg, a person or property? Well, I can look at a variety of legal criteria. I can look at state laws, I can look at federal law to decide what defines a person, what has personhood. You might remember during the 2012 election, there was a big debate over whether corporations are people. And Mitt Romney looked at it one way, President Obama looked at it another. So we do have some interesting legal criteria where person, in fact, is more complicated than we might think it is. And does an embryo meet that definition? Can we define through legal means what exactly an embryo is? Well, here's where it gets complicated. Women can sell their eggs, as you know from chapter 8 in our textbook. Men can sell sperm, and people can buy them. And they can also rent a surrogate mom to carry that baby to term. Well, if somebody can buy all the components, there's a market for eggs, there's a market for sperm, there's a market for a surrogate mother, and we've paid for all these things, what have we really created? Have we created a person or have we created property? At the same time, we all know that buying and selling human beings is something that's profoundly illegal. We have sex trafficking laws. We fought a war over slavery. I mean, these are things that are pretty much established in our law, that buying and selling human beings is not something that we think should be legal. However, when we get into these cases of surrogacy and buying and selling eggs and buying and selling sperm, things get messy. They get more complicated. And this is where definition arguments become really, really complex. What category does this activity fit into? If I have all these components and I create a human being, have I created something that I can buy and sell, or have I created something that is a person that cannot be bought and sold? So it's an interesting argument. And this is one where it's very important to understand the beliefs and values of you and the beliefs and values of your audience. Let's keep going. That's too hard to solve this morning. Here's some interesting problems that you might run into. And of course, you guys know who this person is. This is RuPaul in both of his guises. RuPaul as a female impersonator, a drag queen, and RuPaul as his biological male self. So would we decide that RuPaul is a man or a woman? Or would we decide that he is somebody who acts like a woman when he's dressed like a woman, but doesn't when he's not? What category would he fit into? Dictionary won't help us very much with that. And dictionaries themselves fall into different categories. The American Heritage Dictionary is more of a descriptive dictionary in the sense that it shows how words are used. The Merriam-Webster series are what are called prescriptive dictionaries by and large, where they say, nope, here's how these words are supposed to be used. RuPaul may also be kind of an indication of limits of a definition. Biological male, but maybe he stops being a male when he dresses like a woman. Is there a difference there? And this gets into some really interesting questions with like transgender students. You've all heard about different bathroom disputes in high schools and middle schools over students and what bathrooms they can use. These are fundamentally definition arguments. Is this transgender person a male or a female? Or is there some other category that they fit into that needs to be accommodated? And we get into these kinds of debates all the time. Okay. There's a couple of other ways to think about this. One is to think about it in Aristotelian terms. We take this example, we put it into a larger category, and we find specific attributes. We look for things that we can determine deductively about a particular item. You know, the cars would be a good example in here. We say, well, these are cars that are built in the United States, manufactured, American workers, American parts. The money that's spent on them returned to American workers and an American subsidiary of an overseas company. And we can deduce, maybe with all that, we can say, well, maybe these are American cars. Other people could say, no, let's put them into a different category. We'll put them into foreign manufacturers who just happen to make them in the United States, and corporate profits flow to an overseas corporation. So what category would we put them in then? That's more of an overseas thing, international or foreign company, so they're really foreign cars. So you can see how we can argue about that. Operational, this is a little bit more simple, I think, in some ways, but it's hard to execute, where you assemble a series of data points, what we call empirical data, things you can see and touch and feel and hear and examine. And that we don't really dispute the context, but we do dispute the criteria, we do dispute the judgment. And so somewhere between these two, you might see two different ways of approaching this issue of definition. One of my favorite examples is, what's an assault weapon? We talk a lot about assault weapon bans now. We used to have one from 1994 to 2004. Is that a term of art? Is it a real thing? People who are pro gun ownership tend to say there's no such thing as an assault weapon. It's just a semi-automatic weapon that looks scary. And then other folks say, oh no, assault weapons have very specific functions and very specific purposes. I'm not prepared to answer that question of what fits in that category and whether that category is a useful one or not. But fundamentally, that is a definition argument. And again, different people are going to argue from different perspectives, some from the Aristotelian perspective, some from an operational one. How do we solve these things? Well, you can say it's reportive. How have other people used it? We have an assault weapons ban that we had from, as I said, from 94 to 2004. Can we look at the rules in there and say, well, is that a valid definition of what these things are? Or we could use a stipulative one where we create our own definition and we base it on a series of cases. This is actually what Catherine Jean Lopez, whose picture you see here, did in her essay Eggheads in chapter 8. She says, she defines egg donation as immoral. And she does it with a series of borderline and contrastive cases where she argues that there's no good thing that can come from this. But that's fundamentally what her argument is a definition one. Not completely, but in part. So again, if you're doing a definition argument, which it's just tough, and you may very well find yourself doing depending on what your topic is, remember that there are limits. Remember that you've got to have examples that make your definition work, and you've also got to have counterexamples to show the limits of that definition. Okay. No definition is so sweeping that it's going to solve everything. If you're wondering, by the way, this is a fertilized egg. This is blown up several 100,000 times, and this will give you an idea of what Lopez is talking about. A resemblance argument is similar to a definition one, but it's a little bit less precise. And normally we use it as part of a larger argument. We use it as part of making a larger case. And the idea is transferring audience feelings about one thing to something else. And of course, here I have the Kardashians, who you may have very interesting feelings about. A resemblance argument may be an appeal to pathos, but it still has to make logical sense. There has to have some basis to it that makes sense in a logical way. A very common example is where we talk about government budgets like a family budget. We say, well, if the government doesn't have enough money, we've got to tighten our belts, we've got to make decisions about priorities, things like that. It's a weak analogy, but it's one that you hear frequently used by politicians when they want to cut things and don't want to raise taxes. Because they say, well, families can't do those things. But of course, families do all sorts of things. They borrow money. They'll max out their credit cards. They'll dip into their retirement savings. There's all kinds of different things that families do. There are things that governments don't do, although there are other things that governments do that families don't. Okay, governments build roads, run prisons, operate a school system. And even if you're pouring your own driveway concrete, homeschooling your children, and then placing all kinds of limits on what they can do or grounding them, you're still not running a prison or building highways or providing a full up education system for a large number of the public. So the resemblance argument in that particular case, government budget like a family, breaks down pretty fast. But it's an easy, simple, cheap, what we might call facile, F-A-C-I-L-E, one of my favorite words, arguments, not one that holds up well under scrutiny. Okay, what are the two types? Basically, our textbook says they fall into these categories: analogy arguments, governments like a family, and precedent. The Y term is something that happened in the past that we think is happening in the present. You see this a lot now where people look at the actions of Donald Trump and some of his appointees, and they see creeping fascism. There are other folks who look at this and say, well, this is getting even. But other folks say, no, this is creeping fascism. We're going to be like Nazi Germany. Oh my God. Now you may accept or reject that argument, but you have to understand that the argument is a resemblance one that follows this idea of being a precedent. More common ones are ones where we look at our actions in Afghanistan, our nation's longest war, and we say, well, the Afghanistan war is just like the war in Vietnam, which is our second longest war until we started fighting there. These pictures, by the way, are from the Department of Defense. They're pictures of soldiers fighting in Afghanistan. I've never been there. I fought in the Gulf War in 1990, 1991, but I retired from the Army before 9/11, so I've never been involved in these activities. Okay, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and annexing the Crimea, it's just, some people have argued, it's just like what Hitler did when he moved into the Sudetenland in 1938, and it precipitated World War II. Is that the same kind of thing? These are precedent arguments. Analogy arguments are ones where we have something that we're trying to compare to something else, but we do it in a way that kind of obscures what's really going on. And again, we have developed and extended. Undeveloped are ones that are short, where we don't explain them in detail, governments like a family, and extended ones are very long ones. And this may involve discussions of, I don't know, American Revolution leading to the French Revolution, where we say that, the activities that in the French Revolution are analogous to what happened in the American Revolution, or vice versa. It's true, by the way, that the French were inspired to have their own revolution after our own, but it was partly because the American Revolution bankrupted the French government because they gave us so much support. So it's a complicated issue. So some things to think about. Make sure the analogy or precedent is clear in the audience's mind. And when you're writing them, of course, you're going to draw attention to the points that you want to use. Make sure that the majority of points support your side. But don't overreach. Don't argue for exact correlation. Point out similarities and differences and outcomes. And if there are big dissimilarities, then acknowledge them, concede those. Don't overstate your case. That's the problem with that government like a family argument, because most of the time people making it overstate their case, massively oversimplify the process, and end up obscuring what's really going on. I don't know if you noticed, but in a previous slide we had founding fathers, which we tend to think of as Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Monroe. Here, if you're a Native American, you might have very different ideas about who your founding fathers are. What have I just done? I've made a resemblance argument. What are we really talking about when we talk about founding fathers? Are the founding fathers of these Indian tribes the same as the founding fathers of our own country? Okay. The third type and the last group, what I'll talk about in this presentation, is one that maybe is the most common, cause and effect arguments. Does X cause Y? The one that pops up all the time, of course, is does human activity cause global warming? The evidence for that, most scientists would tell you, 97% of them would say it is indisputable, but not everybody agrees. There's basically three different ways to do this. One is to say, here's this causal mechanism that we can explain directly. We can use inductive logic to establish a high probability of a causal link, or we can argue by analogy or precedent. Okay. One of the ways to think about this, what choice you would make is, we have more tornadoes in the Midwest now than we had 20 years ago. Is this caused by global warming? And the answer that many people would say is yes, it does, because global warming raises the temperature of oceans where most of our weather patterns occur. We have higher water temperatures, so we have higher air temperatures. As a result of that, the air is more unstable when it collides with cold air masses coming down from the north. And so one of the effects of this is an increasing amount of tornadoes. Well, why are water temperatures higher? Well, many people would argue it's because the atmosphere is warmer, and so the oceans are higher as a result of that. Okay. What's the process we just went through for that? Well, we look at induction. We look at the increase in water temperature. We look at the increase in air temperature. These are things we established inductively by compiling a set of examples, a data set, and then we can draw inferences from those data sets. That's what we mean by induction. Some of the problems with cause and effect ones is that we can oversimplify the cause so much. You just saw a recent political figure say that the reason we have so many school shootings is because of pornography. What? I mean, who knows? But that is an oversimplified cause and effect thing. You'll also hear the same thing. People say, well, gun-free zones attract shooters. They know that they can get a free ride there. And so that's one where you have what's called an immediate remote cause. Just because these areas are available doesn't necessarily mean that people think about these things ahead of time and say, oh, I think I'll go shoot up a school today because there's no chance of being shot. That's a really interesting one, but I think it fits into that category. Another one to think about is confusing precipitating and contributing. What's a major contribution? What's a minor contribution? If you go back to the Columbine case, for instance, for school shootings, which I seem to be talking about way more than I should today, one of the claims made is, oh, these guys spent all their days playing Doom, therefore video games make violent people, and we should ban video games because that's what caused a school shooting. Where we could argue that that was really a contributing cause in this case. One of the reasons these kids played Doom all the time is that they were bullied, they were marginalized at school, they didn't have any friends, and that was probably the major reason that they did what they did. So people get confused about major and minor stuff all the time, and I think it's just a case of people trying to find simple explanations to complex problems. There's always various constraints that we have to place on these things because we don't know everything. We just know what we know. And that's, of course, the great problem with induction. Finally, there's this issue of necessary and sufficient cause. Okay, Necessary, it has to be present for a given effect, but a sufficient cause always producing a given effect. A light switch, for instance, we know that it always produces a given effect. It'll turn a light on or off. What's necessary is electricity, but it's not the major reason that the light switch works the way that it does. The light switch is designed to produce a specific outcome each and every time that we use it. This gets complicated, and I'm not sure I'm explaining it very well. One of the things you might want to do is go back and review this in our textbook. Here are some examples of how this works. Does human activity cause global warming? That's the classic cause and effect one. Does playing violent video games increase violence in real life? That's one that you'll hear frequently, although there's very, very little evidence for that. Does abstinence-only sex education reduce pregnancy or STDs or sexual activity? We have some evidence that suggests that it doesn't, that in fact it increases those things because people are ill-educated about some aspects of sexuality. Do school shootings happen because of gun-free zones? Did Russian interference sway the 2016 presidential election? That's a cause-consequence one. All of these, by the way, rely on induction. And there's a separate video that I prepared on logic that you should take a look at. That's the end of this group of slides. We'll go on to part 3.